and some of his crew took a trip ashore and came back with some bang, which they drank. And this is Bowery's account of the huge amount of hilarity amongst the crew, followed by a lot of falling over and finally insensibility. And we also have, bottom right, Mordecai Cook's Seven Sisters of Sleep, which is addressed, I think, to all lovers of tobacco, of opium, hashish, etc. It was published in 1860 and may have been the inspiration for parts of Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which came out 5 years later. And here the hookah smoking caterpillar. On to the next one, thank you. We also look at Baudelaire and the Club des Aschichins and artists like Delacroix. This isn't a Delacroix, but this is from our own collections in the Wellcome Library. This is by Frederick Lewis, a painting of the Drugs Bazaar in Constantinople. And then on to Henri Michaud, who did these extraordinary and really rather very kind of controlled and quite rigorous experiments with mescaline and drawing under the influence of mescaline and trying to see what happened and how the pen moved across the page. And the next one. And then a contemporary work, a big film installation that you walk into by the Canadian artist Rodney Graham about the experience of swallowing a tab of acid in the Tiergarten in Berlin. And on to the next one. So that's the sort of the individual experimenters with drugs, but we also very importantly want to look at the cultural practices of sort of collective intoxication. And so at bottom right, a peyote ceremony, and to the left of that is a carver root, which is one of many plant materials that we're borrowing from the Economic Botany collection at Kew. And above that, a print of a carver ceremony in the Friendly Islands in the South Pacific, something which I believe is deeply embedded, to kind of cultural ceremony, part of the fabric of society in the South Pacific, a kind of communion of carver drinking. And it's said to encourage cordial conversation and comfortable silence. And in fact, I think it's common that you're expected during carver drinking to whisper to your neighbour rather than talk too loudly, because it amplifies the sound of voices. And this is carver is something that you might give as a wedding present. So it's a kind of a peace offering and an act of communion, something that would be offered also to visiting dignitaries. There's a photo in the book of the Queen being offered a bowl of carver in Fiji, and it doesn't show whether she actually drinks any of it or not. But and on to the next one. Then coming kind of closer to home, we're commissioning somebody called Joshua White, who made light shows to accompany bands at the Fillmore East in New York in particular in the 60s and possibly into the 70s. So concerts by Jefferson Airplane, for example, he designed these fantastically elaborate light shows, and he said to us that he would very happily recreate one of these, and that he can remember exactly what he needs to do that, because he was one of the few people who didn't actually take LSD, and therefore he can remember exactly what happened at these things and can remember how to recreate them. And the next slide. And he's making this kind of fantastically Heath Robinson apparatus for us, which to run this kind of program of light projections using bowls of oil with light shining into them. And this is his model that he's just sent us a photograph of, that he wants to create in the exhibition. Then onto the drugs trade. As I mentioned before, because it's such a huge subject, it was decided to really concentrate on one substance, and opium seemed to be the obvious one. An extraordinary story, and it allows us to talk about drugs and the economy and about global politics, and also I think a nice way into talking about the beginnings of legislation and about addiction. And so on the right is one of a lovely series of kind of amateur hand watercolours, borrowed again from Kew, of opium plantations in India. And on the other side, Red Rover, one of the opium clippers that would have carried opium very, very fast from Calcutta to China, lining the pockets of the East India Company and the British government as well in the process, but also, of course, helping to spread addiction to opium in China, but allowing us to keep buying tea from them. And there is some fantastic material relating to the opium wars of the 19th century. So these extraordinary prints, for example, this is a factory and storage place in Patna in India, at top left, with these balls of opium being stored floor to ceiling. And then a rather nice contemporary response to the subject of the opium wars is this artwork by the Chinese artist Huang Yongping, where everything is kind of sort of blown up to large scale, whether it's the scales or the balls or this enormous 12-metre long opium pipe, which will be one of the features of the exhibition. And at the far end of the opium pipe, you can't quite see, is Lord Palmerston, the man who kind of won the vote to go to war with China to try to re-establish the right to trade with the Chinese, and he's lying kind of at the smoking end of the pipe. Then on to the next one. And then, as I said, I think opium's a good way to begin to talk about the beginnings of legislation against drugs on an international scale. And this is Gustave Doré's very kind of lurid portrait of an opium den from 1872 in the East End of London, an image that would have kind of helped instill fear of its spread and use in Britain. And in America, shortly after this work was made, in 1887, legislation was passed to ban the import of opium. And then really the last section of the exhibition looks at legislation and at temperance and prohibition. And of course, next slide, please. And actually, can you go on to the next one as well, and then back to this one? Of course, then it wasn't very long before they also banned alcohol in 1919 in the States, not just the import of it, but the making of it and the selling of it. Sorry, can you go back, Vivian? Thank you. So in this section we decided, because again the issues of legislation are so complex and difficult to explore in detail in an exhibition, it could be quite dull. So what we thought we would do is concentrate on alcohol and on early attempts to deal with what was known as the alcohol question, because it seems to raise at this very early stage at the turn of the century many of the issues that remain relevant to any attempts at drug control, and also attempts to educate and about drugs. And really Mike's idea, I think, for this section was that there were kind of three ways of looking at this problem. One was through education, one was through criminalisation, and another way of looking was the kind of medicalisation of the project. Beginning with the idea that many people thought with alcohol, well, it's not alcohol itself that's the problem, because I drink loads of it and I'm fine. So the underlying problem with these people who seem to get addicted, it must be something to do with them and some kind of perhaps underlying almost pathology, I suppose. So kind of taking that view as a starting point, but also looking at the temperance movement. And there's this lovely checkbook from our own collections, this temperance pledge book, where you sign a pledge of abstinence, and you take that away with you, but the Temperance Society keeps the stub, like the checkbook, so that they know what you've signed up to. And then a label, rather lovely label, from a bottle of coca wine, which may have been a wine that combined wine and cocaine, but under temperance lots of these wines were sold with the alcohol removed, but of course sometimes the cocaine would probably still have been in there, but it would nonetheless have been sold as a kind of tonic wine, a sort of a temperance drink.